Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Kansas City Public Library. I'm Carrie Coogan, Deputy Director of Community Engagement and Public Affairs. We're really thrilled to have all of you here tonight for this conversation. And we're also here that you're glad that you're here to mark Constitution Week. Did you know? Time to reflect on the document that frames our democracy and continues to spark debate more than 2 centuries later. I also want to offer a special welcome to all of our patrons and visitors who are joining us from the library's YouTube channel. Thank you from the library for joining us from all over the country. We'll be taking your questions tonight through the chat, and then for those of you who are here, we'll be taking questions with the microphones at the end of the presentation. So we hope you'll come down and ask your questions here. The U.S. Constitution has been amended only 27 times and just once since 1971. That stability inspires both admiration and frustration. Some believe the text should be read exactly as written, while others argue it must adapt to new realities. Tonight's speaker helps us navigate those questions. Charles Zug is an assistant professor of political science and constitutional democracy at the University of Missouri, and as well, he's a part of the Kinder Institute, who we partner with at MU as well, great partners. And he also has earned his PhD at the University of Texas at Austin, and is the author of Demagogues in American Politics and Dwight Eisenhower and the Federal Highway Act. He also has 2 more books on the way. One final quick note. Looking ahead to Thursday night, right here at the Plaza, September 25th, we welcome back award-winning historian and New York writer Jill Lepore. She's going to be sharing insights from her new book, We the People, another book, A History of the U.S. Constitution. So we hope that you will sign up and join us here on Thursday night. For now, please join me in welcoming tonight's guest, Charles Zug.
Thank you, everybody, for showing up on a Monday. I really appreciate the warm welcome and being here in this beautiful library. So here's my game plan. I want to keep it within time so we have plenty of room for discussion and Q&A. So I'll try to talk for about 40 minutes. And this talk is on work that I've published, so I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, but I want to try to present it in the most sort of common sense language possible, the most sort of approachable language possible, so that we can have an inclusive discussion. Carrie told me to, not be too academic, which I think is great advice, because I am an academic, and frankly, I get kind of sick of listening to us talk about this stuff esoterically. So my kind of main takeaways, and then I'll go through the argument in sort of 4 stages. My main takeaways are that, and this might sound kind of weird, but I'll try to explain what I mean by it, is that in the United States, we tend to think about the Constitution too legalistically. What I mean is that arguments about what the Constitution is, what it's supposed to be and do, tend to assume that disagreements about constitutional authority can be resolved by means of legal adjudication, and that ultimately the Supreme Court is supposed to do all of that work. And that's not totally wrong, but it misunderstands kind of the main essence of what the Constitution is. The Constitution is about harnessing and channeling political competition, and hopefully harnessing them in the service of public goods. And so I call that, using a term from a forthcoming book by a good friend of mine, Thomas Bell, at the University of Kansas Press, called The Constitution of Conflict. And so that's what I'll be referring to, that was sort of my understanding of what the Constitution is and what it's supposed to be, as opposed to the legalistic Constitution, which is how we typically talk about these things. So what is constitutional legalism? As I mentioned already, it's the assumption that the Constitution requires us to resolve disputes between different parts of the state, whether it be between the Congress and the courts and the president, or between the federal government and the state governments, that there is a legal solution to those kinds of conflicts, as opposed to those conflicts get negotiated through political conflict. Legalism occurs, as I think about it, occurs in sort of three different forms or versions. And they say and do different things, but they all sort of share this underlying premise about the supposedly legal nature of the Constitution. So the first version of these, I call, by the way, I've made up all of these terms, so if they don't make sense, you can blame me. I'm not leaning on other scholars for them. The first version of legalism is what I call gridlock theory. And this will be familiar to all of you. In fact, I think all three of these will be familiar to all of you. Gridlock theory is the idea that when there is conflict that results in stalemate and inaction, that's the Constitution working properly. Now it seems kind of odd, right? And you imagine this, I mean, this happens all the time, right? It's been happening for a long time. The sort of classical example of it is a government shutdown, right? When the two branches of the American state that need to reach accommodation and negotiate something out, namely a budget, can't do it, and so that freezes spending for the state for all the most essential services, which continue to be funded, but everything else shuts down, right? And there are some people who, if you ask what is wrong with the Constitution, they would say, no, it's supposed to do that, right? And so I think that's wrong, but it's wrong in a particular way that people don't always get quite right, so I'll explain that in a second. The second kind of legalism is what I call doctrinalism. And this is the idea that the Constitution is an attempt to define in advance, as precisely as possible, the exact kind of authority that every constitutional office or institution is supposed to have, right? And so the aspiration of doctrinalism is that if we can somehow divine the supposed intentions of the Constitution, or maybe its framers, or the people who ratified it, or the Supreme Court, or something like that, that we could solve these institutional conflicts perfectly well, right? And again, I don't think I have to give you examples of the sorts of constitutional conflicts that can arise, because they're arising all the time today, but they've been doing that ever since the Constitution's founding. So doctrinalists would say we just have to kind of divine the correct textual or principled understanding that would lead us to a resolution of those conflicts. And then here's a version of legalism that you might be a little bit less familiar with, because it tends to, people don't necessarily justify their positions in these terms, even though sometimes it's what they mean. I call it the separation of functions. So sometimes when people argue about whether a specific state action or task should be done by an administrative agency, or it should be legislated by the Congress through the Article 1, Section 6 process, or whether it can be decided unilaterally by the president, or whether the courts have the authority to overturn any of those familiar kinds of claims, we might ask ourselves, well, which of those institutions is best positioned to do that task, right? Which institution is sort of best equipped to handle that kind of issue, right? And I think this is the most sophisticated of those three versions of legalism, because it's actually asking, how do we make the Constitution work for the common good, right? Assuming that the president is better at handling certain kinds of things, maybe certain foreign policy types of things, and the Congress is better positioned at aggregating opinion about domestic issues, maybe. I mean, those are just sort of off the top of the dome. But so there's something sophisticated about it. The problem, though, is that it asks us to do something with the Constitution, which the Constitution itself refuses, which is to clarify exactly what kind of work each of the different parts and departments of the state should do, and separate them so they can go do that work and never have conflict. And the problem with that is the Constitution, as I'll try to describe in a second, purposely induces conflict. You could not design a political system with more overlapping sources of authority, more ways in which you need buy-in from multiple power centers and multiple constituencies to do basic things than the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is primed for conflict. And so the question is, what's the point of this conflict? What's the purpose of it? And are there better and worse kinds of conflict? I think there are, and I'll try to explain what that means. So thinking about the Constitution as conflict-oriented makes more sense of the text, because if the Constitution really did want to resolve all conflict in advance or separate functions and assign them to different institutions, it could have done that. The state constitutions that were in existence in 1787 at the time of its drafting did that. They were bad constitutions. They did not function well, but they were much, much clearer in terms of separating powers and functions and in trying to sort of get around the sorts of conflicts that we want. And so the actual text and structure of the Constitution doesn't advance those goals. And we see this in the way that the American state has functioned since its very, very beginning. We see the text inducing these kinds of conflicts from the very outset. Major conflicts between the Congress and the president, less so the courts, because the courts were like kind of the pipsqueaks of there wasn't always the big, powerful Supreme Court that people defer to these days. Originally, the Supreme Court, no one really cared about what it had to say. It was mainly conflicts between the House and the Senate and the president, and then the agencies that the Congress created. And the question is, like, why? Why would a reasonable person or a reasonable public choose a system that works this way? Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe a reasonable person wouldn't choose this kind of system, but I think you can make an argument to at least a plausible argument to defend the idea of why. So this is how I think about it. A constitution exists to pursue goals beyond itself and more important than itself. And that might sound like obvious or like that might just not sound like it means anything, but it's actually a controversial view, because most people think about the Constitution legalistically as a law. And laws, it's not clear the goals they exist to pursue. We sometimes say you just have to obey the law because it's the law, right? Those are the rules, right? It's not clear what broader objectives or aspirations they're oriented towards. But the Constitution tells us in its first sentence that it exists to pursue goods beyond itself. We call that the preamble, right? And it lists a set of public goods: general welfare, domestic tranquility, common defense, blessings of liberty, stuff like that, right? Sort of basic public goods that any decent community would aspire to pursue. And so then the question is, how do you pursue goods like that by then setting up a political system that is bent on conflict, right? That actually encourages officers of the state to disagree with each other. And it goes something like this. There's two views. The first is that good government in any form consists in multiple competing aspirations, right? And those aspirations, if we lean into any one of them, will actually become bad, right? What do I mean by these aspirations? So the examples that I usually give are every community needs to be able to defend itself. Every community has an interest in being able to deliberate with a minimal degree of thoughtfulness about problems of public policy. Every community should protect the basic rights and liberties of people, and maybe especially people who the state is otherwise inclined to abuse or oppress. Every state has an interest in being able to act decisively when the moment calls for it, not sluggishly, not wait around to be destroyed by terrorists or foreign invasion or domestic insurrection or what have you, right? Now, each of those aspirations or goals is good, but if you make the state around one of them entirely, it will be a bad state. So, if you make the state so that it's really, really good at deliberating, that state will never act, right? If it was only the Congress, and we learned this, the constitutional experience of the United States, with the Articles of Confederation, which was the constitution that preceded the one that we've had now for about 230, 240 years. The Articles of Confederation was really good at setting up conversations between legislators. They could talk and talk and talk and talk, and it required unanimity to do anything important, which is, if you can imagine something even more frustrating than the filibuster, well, that's more frustrating, right? Because the filibuster, if you can get to 61, you can pass something. Unanimity, you need to literally get every state delegation on board, and it never passed anything, right? The only thing it passed was saying that we need to replace this Constitution and get a new one, because it was unworkable, right? So now deliberation is good, though, when you need to take a long time as a group to come to a decision, bring in a lot of viewpoints, really hash things out. You want lots of committees, and you want a regularized process for this stuff. I think any reasonable person would say that's desirable, but it's not desirable if you have to act quickly, protect yourself, right? Resolve a civil war, for example, where the very life of the state might hinge on a split-second decision. By the same token, do you want a state that only acts quickly? I don't think so, right? When we have to make decisions too quickly, we act stupidly, right? And that's not because we are stupid necessarily, but we don't think things through, right? We don't get input and data that we need in order to understand what the long-term consequences of our actions will be. We don't hear from groups who, might be sort of out there and need to be brought in more. We want to move quickly, and so we want to avoid a protracted discussion. We want to protect rights, and I think that's an admirable, aspiration. But sometimes when the community needs to, say, mobilize in response to a crisis, we have to think about which rights we prioritize the most, right? And you can fill in whatever crisis you think would be most important to mobilize society for in there. I'm not going to tell you which ones I think is most important, but the kinds of crises that might require us as individuals to, give up some of our freedoms, maybe make sacrifices even, which is, a controversial thing to ask, I guess, but sometimes that's what we have to do in a community. The way we think about how to balance rights over and against those public needs, we have to figure it out, right? And so if a government leans too far in any of those directions, it threatens instability and collapse. So that's a sort of, you might say, the Constitution is an attempt to capture those different dimensions of politics and reconcile them in some way by empowering institutions that are designed to do those things, right? That's the goal. Now, again, whether this works in practice now, to what the extent it's ever worked, is debatable, and we can have that conversation, but that is one of the goals. Here's the second argument about why you would design a constitution that is oriented towards conflict. Human beings are conflict-oriented themselves, right? It is sown into the seeds of human beings to compete for scarce resources and goods, and it's also sown into the nature of human beings to form irrational attachments to their groups and their clans and their families and their parties, and act in ways that maybe a reasonable, objective person wouldn't do. Now, if you're trying to design a functional state, you can either pretend like that's not the case and design the state with aspirations in mind that do not acknowledge the sort of conflictual nature of us all. And I would say you'd be setting yourself up for failure, right? Because you're asking human beings to do what they simply, in their group capacity, are not hardwired to do, right? The other, and by the way, human history is rife with examples of constitutions that have done precisely this and have failed miserably, right? The other option is you try to design a political system that in some way assumes that human beings act this way, and you try to harness the public good insofar as it's possible to do things in the public good. You try to harness the public good to that conflictual impulse, right? And the way the United States tries to do this is by establishing a bunch of offices and saying that these are the most powerful offices in the polity, in the regime. The most ambitious, power-hungry, megalomaniacal type people are going to be attracted to those offices, right? The ability to wield power over other human beings will attract them, but that none of that power is concentrated into a single set of hands, right? It's multiple different offices that have to cooperate and negotiate in order for the state to act decisively in the long term. And then if you add that argument to the argument that I developed previously, that these institutions are in some ways designed to do different things. So if, for example, the presidency is one person, right? You only have one president at a given time. That's not a random decision. When an institution has only one person in it, and you have to sort of abstract from any given president and think about the presidency as an office, as an institution. When an institution is controlled by one person, that incentivizes certain kinds of behaviors. Makes them better to make decisions quickly. It encourages hierarchy. It maybe makes them better at keeping secrets, right? Not sure how comfortable we are with that, but it is easier to keep a secret in the presidency than it is in the Congress, right? Congress has literally never kept a secret ever, maybe with the exception of the Manhattan Project, but even that, and that was just congressional leadership that knew about how those funds were being spent, right? By the same token, the Congress is really, really good at arguing. It's really, really good at bringing a bunch of people together who sort of want different things and trying to kind of force them to develop compromise. And at its best, the Congress has done this successfully, right? If you look back through American history, the most impressive achievements, legislative achievements, have happened despite massive, sometimes tectonic disagreements between the different parts of the Congress. And the courts, what are the courts good for? I don't know. I guess the courts are better positioned to focus on the specifics of the law and to focus more on individual rights, right? That's something that they could potentially be good at. Now, I want to say again, as I've been saying the entire time, none of this is a guarantee that it'll work, right? You have to put yourself in the mindset of someone who's thinking, if I were to try to come up with a better constitutional system, a decent constitutional system, what would the materials be that I would want to work with? How would I try to deal with these issues? And this is the best case that I can make for our current Constitution. Okay, now what this way of thinking about the Constitution does is allow us to rethink a bunch of sort of principles that are associated with the American constitutional tradition. So I'm going to go through 4 of those. They'll be familiar to all of you. If you know anything about the Constitution, you'll have heard of these. And I'm going to try to show how think about it as the Constitution of conflict sheds a different light on these principles. So the first of these is the idea of legislative power. One thing you'll hear all the time from Constitution scholars is that only Congress should be making laws, right? President can't make laws, administrative agencies can't make laws, courts can't make laws. And, there's something to this, right? Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution says the following legislative powers will be invested in Congress of the United States. But the problem is we have to ask, what do we mean by laws? What do we mean by legislative power? The Constitution assigns immense powers to entities other than the Congress. So, for example, the pardon power, which is something we all take for granted, has no textual limits. It easily could have, right? The Constitution could have created a process for pardons, that you'd have to get multiple offices to buy into it. It could have put limits on the number of people that can be pardoned, right? But we've seen historically, we've had mass pardons. Recently, we had a set of mass pardons. Jimmy Carter did a mass pardon of people who fled the draft during the Vietnam War, right? Several years after the war concluded, right? So that is a kind of legislation, right? It is law in the sense that a pardon is a pardon. Congress cannot, at least it doesn't seem, according to the Constitution, Congress cannot pass a law that undoes a pardon. There's no procedure for that, right? And it's never been done, it's never been attempted. And if it did, it's not clear what would happen, right? The Supreme Court claims to have the authority to be able to overturn acts of legislation passed by the Congress. Well, if you can nullify legislation, then aren't you doing legislation? Right? If you can say what a law isn't and what it is, then that seems like a legislative power, right? You have to have at least as much power as the institution that created the law in the first place. And no Congress has ever attempted to overturn and I don't even know what that would look like, but ever attempted to overturn a Supreme Court review of legislation by means of simple legislation. They have threatened to impeach judges, and they have passed laws that got rid of an entire federal court system. That's what the Jeffersonians did in 1802 in response to the famous Marbury case. So there's that conflictual nature of the Constitution coming back, right? We have the branches that have these different powers that they can deploy in response to each other's actions. And the hope is that that's supposed to induce them to negotiate and to fight as hard as they think they need to fight in order to vindicate their perspectives and goals. The second idea is discretion. Discretion is the idea that state officials have freedom to make a wide range of choices about how to use state power. And the legalistic view of the Constitution says that discretion should be kept at a minimum. Why? Because if we think that we can define an institution's power in advance, then why would the people in those institutions need discretion? And I would argue that the Constitution accepts discretion as a fact of life. You cannot read the Constitution and the open-endedness of its powers without seeing that discretion is built into it, right? Again, pardon power. I mean, just any number of ways that you could use the pardon power, and it's really the president's discretion to come up with that. Now, what might another branch do in response to a bad use of the pardon? Well, the Congress has an impeachment power. Again, maximal discretion. Constitution gives a very short list of the kinds of things that are impeachable, and the last item on that list is high crimes and misdemeanors. You can fit pretty much any kind of abuse of power into that category, right? The Congress has been unwilling to use the impeachment power, but that's not to say it isn't the best response to a perceived abuse of for example, a pardon. Limited government. Everybody knows this term. Obviously, we're familiar with it. What we often mean by it is you constrain in advance the powers that the state has in the fear that it might abuse those powers. And I would say that the Constitution says you need to give the state all possible power because the kinds of tasks and challenges a state will face in the future cannot be predicted. So then where do the limits come in? How do you prevent authoritarianism or totalitarianism? Once again, you position the branches of government to contest each other's power, right? So if the president takes a measure that the Congress deems unacceptable, defunding of agencies, holding back of nominations to cabinet positions, holding back judgeships, getting rid of agencies, which is the Congress's power to do, ultimately culminating in impeachment. That's how you make a virtue out of constitutional conflict. And lastly, delegation. People will complain that the Congress has delegated too much authority to the president or to administrative agencies. And that might be true. It might be true that the Congress should be making more of those decisions itself, right? But I would say that the Constitution ultimately wants us to pay more attention to what those delegations are making possible in terms of good public policy, and is not principally committed to the idea of delegation. So if the Congress says we need to clean up the environment, or we need to create a commission to examine government waste or something like that, but we, the Congress, have too much going on, we're not well positioned to do that, so we're going to authorize an agency to do that. I would say that can be good, right? If it actually brings about a decent public policy that gets buy-in from the public, which sees its benefits, that's good. There's nothing unconstitutional about that. The Congress need not, though, forget that it has ultimate control over those agencies, that it ultimately reserves the right to change them, undo their charters, defund them, censor them, move officials around. Congress always has that power, and that is not necessarily the president's power. Presidents assert that power, but the Congress has a lot of levers that it can pull in response. I want to end by talking a little bit about political parties. So the obvious response to all of this is, where do political parties fit in, right? What happens when political parties disrupt the attachments that officials have to their office? And we can talk about this more in the Q&A because I see that we're moving in that direction. But my view is that for most of American history, the parties were actually pretty good at working within this system. That is to say, partisan loyalty was powerful enough to aggregate people, especially people in the Congress, to make collective action possible when legislation needed to be passed, and it would sometimes get in the way of legislation. But that when a crisis emerged, for example, the Watergate crisis, you did not see Republicans in the Congress blindly following the Nixon administration. In fact, it was a group of Republican senators following Barry Goldwater of Arizona who made the trip to the White House to urge President Nixon to resign in the face of what was coming out through the investigation. It wasn't the Supreme Court, it wasn't a federal court that did that. It was the looming threat of an impeachment and a successful removal by 2/3 of the Senate, which is what the Republicans were saying, that got Nixon to do that. Now, arguably what we've seen, I don't think it's really that arguable, but I would say what we've seen in the last generation, 20 years, 30 years, 10 years, depending on how you want to slice it, is that officials in the Congress and the presidency and the court, to a degree, have increasingly thought of themselves less as constitutional officers, as people whose ambitions are attached to their constitutional office, and instead as partisans, right? And so you see collusion happening between partisans in the Congress and the person who's the president that can prevent adequate oversight and maybe punishment of a president who should be punished by means of an investigation or a successful removal by the Senate. And you can use your imagination to think of the ways that if the courts think of themselves as partisan institutions, how it will manipulate their. So with that, I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thanks for taking my question. I think we can all argue emergencies typically push power toward the executive.
Yeah.
I think we say that. Is there anything in the Constitution or anything that says an emergency is over? Because it seems to me if you watch the news, they'll tell you about an emergency that started, but they never tell you it's over.
Friends.
So what can we do to help the media, the different branches of government, to say, yeah, this was an emergency in, say, 2020, but it is over. And so power could go back to normal. Is there any way we can get an emergency to come to an end? Or is there anything in the Constitution that can say this has a half-life and it's over and we can go back to normal?
Terrific question. Yeah,
Thank you
so much for that. So there's lots of different ways of trying to answer this. The really easy cop-out answer is that the word emergency doesn't show up in the Constitution, right? The Constitution doesn't create a different process for emergency or crisis power, right? It talks about insurrections or in cases of war and stuff like that, but it's not totally clear where those stand in terms of the question you ask. Other constitutions historically and globally have tried to carve out a special process for emergency situations, right? So you can kind of think of you have like the normal law, and then when there's an emergency and you get enough people in the state to trigger the emergency power, you switch into an emergency mode. And in theory, that's a good way of dealing with what you're saying, but what's the problem with that? Once the state goes into emergency mode and suddenly realizes that it can do any number of things way easier, because that's the whole point of being an emergency, you don't have to get consensus, you can just do things, it's hard to give that power back up, right? So like the Weimar experience, to go immediately to the most provocative, but like that, the Weimar Constitution, the Nazis never actually officially repealed it. Right? They claimed to be operating under the Weimar Constitution the whole way through 1945. Again, that's like the worst possible scenario. But, I think having like an emergency provision, it's potentially a dead end, right? So then what you fall back on is the Constitution doesn't carve out a separate procedure or space. And I think the best hope we have, I think this is what the Constitution contemplates, is that the public's experience of the emergency and their feedback to the elected officials will call the emergency, right? And there are cases from American history that showed this to work pretty well. The problem is they basically all came before World War II, right? And there seems to be something about the modern era with technology, with communications, advanced weapons, the nuclear age. There seems to be something, this is not just an American problem, this is a global problem. There seems to be a tendency to always be ready to reauthorize emergency provisions, right? So the global war on terror is the obvious example here. I mean, we're still in it, apparently, right? We're still in it. Like, presidents are still invoking the global war on terror to do things. It's been 24 years. It's not really clear what incentive either party has to, repeal those major provisions of the Patriot Act and stuff like that. And so, there are some theorists who say emergency is a fact of life now, right? That it's hard to imagine a way to actually claw back that power. I'm not so sure. I don't know. I don't know what it would take for the public, for example, to mobilize adequately to take that power back. Please, yes.
Could you comment on the agency, Congress, it creates these agencies or these departments, and now they don't appear to be functioning?
Yes.
I used to work for the Fed, and could you also talk about how come the Fed...
Kansas City Fed?
Yes.
Yeah.
And how come that's separate? Because that brings in the judiciary. So
Yes.
that's kind of all three involved. So could you talk about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, fantastic question. So part of the problem is we're taught to think about those agencies as being part of the executive branch. And if that's the case, then that would seem to suggest that the chief executive, the president, should control their branch, right? The executive branch is a term that never occurs in the Constitution. And it's easy to see why. It's the Congress that creates these agencies, right? The president doesn't, it's not like the president is the taproot and all these executive agencies emerge out of the presidency. The Congress creates the agencies because the Congress controls the money under the Constitution, right? So the Congress says, here's the big chunk of money in the budget, and here's the legislation that establishes the agency and that specifies the kind of control that the president will have and the power of the courts to review, and that we, the Congress, reserve to kind of check in on things, right? But what's happened is, and this is a long story, so I'm not going to get into it, but there's a lot you could read about it. There are a lot of people for a long time who think that the president should have more direct control over these agencies, right? And there's something to that, because agencies can become insulated from the public. Now, sometimes you want agencies to be insulated from the public, because if it's an agency that's pursuing a fairly neutral thing, like, I don't know, cleaning up water or air or something, hopefully there's enough buy-in to say that it's a fairly neutral task, right? And that it's not so much a political or partisan issue what it means to have clean water. Maybe it is. I don't know. The people who would say it is a political decision to figure out what clean water makes, they would say, we want the president to have more direct control over the agency, to be able to fire people in it, right? Now, you talk about the Fed. That's a really interesting example, right? So the Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act in 1912 and has continued to kind of build out the authority of that institution. And the way it's written, that legislation is written, is that the members of the Fed, people within the Fed, should be fairly insulated from direct political pressure in the form of removals or firing by the president, right? And this, cuts both ways, right? Because you'd say, well, monetary policy is a very technical kind of policy making. The temptation for a president to juice the Fed, to try to get outcomes that will make them popular in the short run, but that will be disastrous for the economy in the long run, that will be a temptation for the president if they have firing and hiring power. And so that's why the Congress wrote the law that way. People would also say, okay, but so you're telling me that the main lever that exists for controlling the flow of money and credit in a democracy, supposedly a democracy, is going to be way out of the hands of the public in terms of the public's elected officials being able to control it. I can see why that would be a concern too, right? And so, we live in a world where the people who have wanted more direct presidential control over these agencies have won. They've won for the first time in American history. They've got a majority on the Supreme Court, The Congress is very poorly positioned to defend its authority in this matter, right? So in an earlier era, the Congress would have, if the president had, started unilaterally trying to fire people on these boards, the Congress probably would have had something to say about it, because after all, Congress wrote that legislation and funds the operations of those agencies. So you'd think they would care about it, but Congress being what it is today, we don't get that follow through. And so the people sue, it goes to the Supreme Court, and so far the Supreme Court has upheld the president's authority to do these things. So until we see Congress deciding it wants to play a more active role, I don't see that trend going anywhere. I think this court is determined to bolster the president's power. Yeah, sir.
Okay, going back to near the beginning, Marbury versus Madison.
Yeah.
I don't understand what the Supreme Court's power was before that case,
Yeah.
and how did that case interpret it to what it is today?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a bunch of things going on there. It was unclear what the Constitution contemplated in terms of the Supreme Court's role, right? So the Constitution doesn't create a federal court system. It gives that power to the Congress. Congress, decides if we're going to have district courts or circuit courts, bankruptcy courts, tax courts. All those things have been created, by the Congress over the years. We didn't even have a circuit court system until the early 20th century. For basically the first half of the country's history, we just had the district courts, and then they appealed directly to the Supreme Court. So that was very different. One possibility was that the Supreme Court would assume the constitutionality of all legislation passed, and its role would basically be to figure out, resolve ambiguities within the text, establish precedents, essentially do what it does today, tell other courts, lower courts, how to resolve similar issues. It didn't necessarily have to have the authority to overturn legislation as unconstitutional. The Constitution itself doesn't say that. You could infer it plausibly. That's what Justice Marshall did in the Marbury case. It's telling that the Marbury case was decided in 1803 or whenever it was, right? The part of the Judiciary Act that the court overturned was something that the people who were in power didn't even care about. So Jefferson and his allies in Congress didn't even care about that. It established the precedent, and then the court didn't use that power again until 1857, Dred Scott versus Taney, overturning the Missouri Compromise. Look how that turned out, right? Kind of blew up in their face. So for a lot of the country's history, the court has been very reluctant to use that power, right? Because it knows that in a direct political fight, it doesn't have an army, it doesn't have a police force, it doesn't control any money. What we've seen is a kind of really the Congress increasingly deferring to the court on issues of constitutionality for lots of complicated reasons. That's started to become more of a precedent in the 20th century. Sometimes it's in the interest of the Congress to defer. If Congress doesn't want to fight some kind of controversial issue, it'll just say, well, let the court take care of it, right? But if you do that enough times, the institution starts to lose its memory. It starts to forget how to stand up in the face of the court, right? And say that, no, we actually have constitutional power as well.
Charles, we have a question coming in from online.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a pathway forward if one branch full sail ignores the Constitution and its boundaries?
Yeah, great question. So the cop-out answer is no, right? I mean, if it devolves into violence, right? If it's just open warfare, the Constitution, it's unclear what the guidance is, right? You know, you can try to salvage it like they did in the Civil War, and to some extent succeeded afterwards during the Reconstruction period. But no, there's no obvious constitutional answer. Now, my wiseacre's response would be that the courts are absolutely not going to save us, right? A lot of people hope that the Constitution's redemption or restoration will come in the form of the courts striking down state measures that are unconstitutional. And here's the problem with that. Even if the court was so disposed, which the Supreme Court has a pretty bad track record of doing this kind of thing, of defending the Constitution. It authorized the expansion of slavery and Dred Scott. It authorized the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, right? It upheld Jim Crow for 70, 80 years, right? And then even when it does try to do decent things like overturn Jim Crow, it takes 20 years for something to actually change. Why? Because the courts have no actual power, right? The courts have no enforcement mechanisms. It comes down to if Congress passes legislation that enables enforcement and the agencies or the president have the political will and capital to actually carry out those laws, right? So, Brown versus Board of Education was handed down in 1953, 1954. It wasn't really until the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Acts and the amendments to those acts in the subsequent decades that meaningful change was made, right? The court just doesn't have that power. So I don't have a good answer. I just say, don't assume the courts are your friends.
This was touched on briefly at the beginning of the evening. Would you be willing to jump into why amendments have not happened in these 5 decades? Thanks.
No, that's a great question. Well, so I would say the first thing is, given how insanely challenging the amendment process is, so for those of you who probably know this, but for those of you who don't, there's 2 avenues to amendment. And the one that's traditionally gone is you have to get 2/3 of the House and the Senate to agree on a proposed amendment, and then those go out to the state legislatures, and 3/4 of the state legislatures have to agree on the exact proposal, right? Now, the other option is to call a convention of the states. And for pretty obvious reasons, we've never done that, right? All 27 amendments. It's really kind of 18 because the first 10 were passed en bloc. They were passed as a single thing, as the Bill of Rights. But all those amendments were passed through the other process. And why is it difficult? I mean, my best guess, and this is not an optimistic thing to say, but as this is it's sort of a paradox. As the political system has become relatively, compared to the founding in the 19th century, relatively more inclusive, right? More barriers to access have gone down. That has created, on the one hand, a better democracy, right? A democracy where slavery doesn't exist and people are relatively free to vote, and there's relative gender equality, at least formally speaking. On the other hand, that has actually made it harder to achieve consensus at the governing level, right? It's kind of a tragic irony, right? Because as the community becomes, you might say, a better version of itself, that has a kind of eroding effect on the sort of elite camaraderie that appears to have been necessary to make the government work during the 19th century. So in some sense, the American state worked quite well in the sense of being able to pass major constitutional amendments, right? Like big, I mean, never major structural changes to the national state, but like, women's suffrage or the Reconstruction Amendments, changing the way that senators vote, allowing for an income tax, right? Kind of like, it's unimaginable that we would do things on that level today. And I think part of the reason for that is when the experience of people, national policymakers, was one of sort of exclusivity, there was a kind of solidarity that came from that came through that elitism, that made collective action more possible. That is a very, if that's true, and it might not be, that's an interpretation, if that's true, it spells major problems for the future of constitutional democracy everywhere, right? Not just in the United States, but everywhere, right? And I guess, I would end the answer by saying, what are the best examples that we can think of multiracial, inclusive constitutional democracy that is also extremely well-functioning, right, in terms of being able to do these kinds of things? It's actually harder to find examples of that than you might think, right? Look at European countries. They haven't done so great, especially when it comes to like racial and religious type conflicts, right? They often function very well precisely because there's a great degree of homogeneity. So, bit of a downer, but yes.
We have one more question here.
Building on the same question, many other democracies have a slightly easier process to amend their constitutions, and some of them don't even have constitutions at all, like the United Kingdom. So do you think that having a constitution or like having such a hard process of amending it as America makes our system stronger or weaker?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the theory of having a difficult amending process goes something like this. The easier you make it to amend, right? Which is like, the easier it is for a foolish, poorly thought out majority to pass transformational, architectonic political change. Now, maybe you want that if the system doesn't work anymore. Maybe you want to lower those barriers, and there's something to that. The case for having higher barriers, making it more challenging, the hope is that it incentivizes more coalition building, a more inclusive process, because the bigger the coalition you have to build to do something, the more you have to kind of appeal beyond just normal appeals to pass normal legislation. And hopefully be more thoughtful, right? Like, do we really, really want to do this? What are the long-term consequences of this going to be? You'd have to go through the experience of all the amendments that have been passed and to think if that's been done successfully. I think we have a fairly spotty track record. I would say I would be very reluctant to make amending easier now. Not because I don't think we need amendments, I think we absolutely do, but who's going to be able to use that power? Do you trust the people who would be able to use that easier amendment mechanism? If you do, then maybe say, yeah, go for it. But I'm not sure I do, which, if we can't amend the Constitution, then the Constitution seems to have failed. Sorry.
We are at about time, and I wanted to go ahead and thank you so much, but I do want to, if you're okay, squeeze in one last question.
Yes.
We have one coming in from online. So question here, how should we look back to all these periods of progress being regressed, like Reconstruction or right now? What can we learn or improve from it?
Yeah. I think it turns out that progress that was made, its stability, its ability to endure, depended on a lot of mobilization and a lot of organization, right? Especially in the form of the Congress, feeling like it had to actually continue to, at the very least, defend those achievements, if not press for additional progress. And, to some extent, the system has been captured by market forces, political forces, partisan forces that have disincentivized mobilization, right? So the gains made through the New Deal, for example, were made through high union density, workers organizing, keeping the pressure on the Congress, to build and keep a welfare state in place. And as that has eroded, we've seen a resultant lack of will by the Congress to defend those. That's what we've seen increasingly.
I want to thank you again. Thank you everyone for your great questions. And
Thank you.